will give a presentation on the new law on investment. And in the meantime, Eurocham team will soon drop a link for everyone to download the law on investment, which is available in Khmer, in English, in France, and also in Italian language. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just quickly also share my slides. Here we go. So again, good afternoon. My name is Noë SCHELLINCK. I am the Advocacy Manager at Eurocham. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I will give a quick introduction to Cambodia's law on investment. A law on investment, which is in fact a quite new law on investment. It was promulgated just last year in the middle of October. As His Excellency Sokchen Sopia already mentioned, there is also an older law on investment from 1994, which was amended in 2003, but this one is now abolished by the new law. So I would say pay attention when you are researching online. Quite a lot of the external sources, they will still refer to that old law of 1994-2003. It's also worthwhile to check out the IDP, the Industrial Development Policy 2015-2025 of Cambodia, and in fact, any of the government strategies for that matter, to get a better idea of where the country is heading in general. The new law on investment was one of the features of the IDP, and that's also the reason why I mention it. But have a look, it gives a good picture of Cambodia's general direction. So in a nutshell, the law on investment is aimed at attracting and supporting both local and foreign investment in Cambodia by giving investor, on the one hand, certain guarantees, and by giving certain sectors also special tax incentives. Before I dive deeper into how this works in practice, I just want to clarify that here with this law on investment, we are talking about a national Cambodian law. And a national investment law is, of course, substantially different from international investment agreements. They operate somewhat together, hence my reference here to the piece of art, Sfera con Sfera. So we are looking at the inner globe, but there's a lot of other layers to the investment universe, you could say. So for example, Cambodia has about 27 bilateral investment treaties, which are really treaties between Cambodia and another country in which it is agreed on a country level how they will treat each other's investors, what guarantees are given, what happens when there is a dispute, and so on. Now, Italy does not have such a bilateral investment treaty with Cambodia, but several other countries have, also European countries. I mentioned a few here on my slide. And that's also why it can be important to structure your investment, especially for larger projects. I would say definitely consult with legal professionals who may be able to tell you before investing in Cambodia directly in your specific area, in your industry. It could be perhaps beneficial if you set up a company first in Germany or maybe in Thailand and use that as an investment vehicle in Cambodia. Not only for tax reasons, that's of course another important one, check the double taxation agreements, but also for reasons of investment protection, which you will also typically find in those bilateral investment treaties. There are also other agreements and treaties with possible relevance to your investment, such as Cambodia's increasing free trade agreements, also agreements in the framework of the WTO and so on. So I would say make sure you have the full picture to be able to fully benefit from all the agreements Cambodia has entered into in recent years. Now, let me quickly return to our national Cambodian investment law, which is the topic of my presentation today. You can see the structure of Cambodia's law on investment here, just to give you a short snapshot. But the important point I want to make in this slide is that next to the law itself, there is also a sub-decree, basically a piece of legislation that implements the law in practice or in further detail. And that sub-decree is still forthcoming. We hope it will be promulgated very soon. And that sub-decree will provide further detail. But to be clear, as such, the law on investment is already operational. Now, today I'm going to focus on 3 points. First of all, to whom does the law on investment apply? Secondly, what does the government guarantee to investors? And then finally, what does the government give to investors? So to start with the scope, the law on investment applies to what we call QIPs, Qualified Investment Projects, which basically means for a QIP, you will have to register your investment project with the CDC, who will approve your investment project. There is an online platform for that. It's qip.cdc.gov.kh. You can easily find it on Google. And that should actually be a fairly short process. Under the law on investment, the CDC guarantees a turnaround for the approval of 20 working days for your registration. The law on investment also applies to EQIPs, which are basically qualified investment projects who expanded. And then finally, GIPs, guaranteed investment projects, which is a bit of special category of investment projects which receive the guarantees I will talk about right away, but not the incentives. Now, for the investment guarantees under the law, and I'm simplifying this in the interest of time, I would say the Cambodian government gives to investors a few positive guarantees and a few negative guarantees. So basically things the government will do and things they will not do in order to protect the investment. Let me start with the things that the government will not do. His Excellency Chenda has already mentioned a few. The first one, no discrimination. And so the government shall not discriminate on the basis of nationality. It was mentioned before. The government will not nationalize your assets in Cambodia. They will not expropriate you, and they will not fix the prices of your products. You will see these guarantees, they are not always absolute as such. So for example, when we look at the no expropriation clause, you will see it actually says, if we have to do it, we will follow due process. The same for the no discrimination. It was mentioned before, there is an exception for land ownership and so on. So the precise wording of the guarantees is obviously very, very important. Now, what are the key positive guarantees? What guarantees the government aside from the previous ones? Well, first of all, you will be able to purchase and repatriate your foreign currencies. Your intellectual property will be protected according to the Cambodian laws. You have the right to use land. And then there are a few other important guarantees, which I call the miscellaneous category here, such as the fact that you can obtain a visa, that you can hire foreigners within certain quota, and so on. So I would say overall a quite typical set of guarantees, but the key takeaway is that there are important protections offered by the government. But look at the precise wording, they are of course not absolute, and to a certain extent I would say the devil can be in the detail. So for example, what is an expropriation? International case law is full of debates around this. What can be precisely an expropriation? But in general I would say you can feel comfortable, but it's of course not a full safe haven. And to close the circle to my previous point, this of course does not take away from the fact that you may have more specific protection under an international agreement or treaty with another country. So next, let me have a look at how the law incentivizes investment in the kingdom. There are roughly 19 sectors under the new law which are incentivized, if they are not excluded. I will come back to that point right away. And there are 3 types of financial incentives. Now, which sectors are incentivized? You will see that this is really very broad, and most are really aimed at, I would say, the new economy, so high-tech, digital sector, electronics, the green economy, but also more classic sectors such as agriculture, tourism, and logistics are part of the incentivized sectors under the new law on investment. So 2 remarks here. As I said, the list is quite broad, and the descriptions of what it precisely means are currently not always clear. That's one thing. And secondly, there will be a negative list, which will exclude certain areas from these incentivized sectors. Both these remarks, they will still be addressed in the sub-decree that I mentioned, and that will be forthcoming very quickly. To give you an idea, the current negative list under the old law on investment, it mentioned obvious things like casinos, for example, but also less obvious things like in the furniture or textile production, if you have a capital of less than $500,000, for agriculture, dairy farms with less than 100 cows, hospitals with less than 50 beds, they're on the negative list, so they will not be able to benefit, at least under the old law, of the incentives under the law on investment. So it's not just the obvious things like no drugs and no gambling. For some areas, there may also be size or capital requirements in order to be able to qualify for the incentives. Now, for these 19 sectors, if you're not excluded, there are 3 types of incentives. There are, first of all, basic incentives, secondly, additional incentives, and also possibly special incentives. I have to go a bit quicker, cognizant of the time, but I would say that the incentives are really quite generous under that new law on investment. Under these basic incentives, first of all, you can choose for, first of all, a tax exemption period where you will have to pay no tax on income for 3 to 9 years, depending on your specific sector, and that is counted from when the first profit is earned by your investment project. And after which the tax on income will only gradually fade in. So under this first option, the maximum incentive here is that only after 16 years, you will have to pay the full amount of taxes, which would be normally due, which is very, very generous under that new law. As an alternative, you can also choose to deduct 200% of certain expenses during a period of 9 years. And this comes together with a few other things, such as an exemption from minimum tax, the fact that you will have to pay no monthly prepayments for your tax on income, and so on. I'm going a bit quicker, apologies for that, but please, have a look at the slide deck afterwards, of course, if you want to know more. As I mentioned, there are 3 categories of incentives. I just addressed the basic incentives, but there are also additional incentives under the new law on investment. So in addition to your basic incentives, so either the option 1 or option 2 that I mentioned, you will get a VAT exemption on your production inputs if you purchase them locally. So if your raw materials and your semi-finished products that you use in your investment project are from Cambodian origin, you will get a VAT exemption on them under the law on investment. That's one important point. But secondly, and this is also, I would say, very progressive under the new law, you will be able to deduct 150% of the cost for research and development in your QIP, but also for things that benefit your staff, like their training, their accommodation and transport, the improvement of your machinery, in general, provision of welfare to your staff, and so on. So as I mentioned here, really a shout out to the government, this progressive provision in the new law, and it really enables companies to improve the livelihoods of their staff under interesting tax conditions. Then finally, this is a bit of a catch-all provision, I would say, but the third type of incentives, they are the special incentives. So basically the government can decide to give extra incentives in addition to what I've mentioned before to certain sectors, and this will be decided in the law on financial management, which is basically the annual budget law of Cambodia. So again, definitely worthwhile to keep an eye on this if you're considering to invest in Cambodia. So that's it for me. It's in a nutshell, but I do hope I was able to illustrate that the new law on investment in Cambodia is a very interesting instrument for both local and foreign investors. If you want to know more, my colleague Ratanik already mentioned it. Together with the CDC and our national chapters, we produced brochures in several language versions, which will give a good recap of everything that that new law on investment has to offer. And of course, reach out to us if you have any questions in this regard. So I would say thank you very much and good luck in Cambodia. You're always welcome at the chamber to discuss further. Thank you.